name's Major Good. I'm the Behavioral Health Consultant for the 6th Recruiting Brigade, and I'm going to make a series of about 3 videos focused on emotion coping and emotion regulation. Now, we're going to transition a little bit into more of a focus on coping and how what we've learned about emotions so far can help us with coping. Okay, so when we talk about emotional coping or managing emotions, a word that frequently comes up is the word stress. But what is stress? Well, stress really isn't a very scientific word. When you look at the scientific definition of stress, it means anything that makes you change your thinking or behavior. So literally anything that happens in the environment could be considered a stressor. But usually what people are talking about when they talk about stress is something hard, right? Stress means something's hard. Now, is stress bad? Well, not necessarily. Most stressors are positive things. Doing hard things is not always a bad thing. Sometimes it's a really good thing. Okay? Now let me explain that. So, in order to explain that, I'm going to use an analogy. And I think weightlifting is one of the best analogies out there for how human beings grow, both mentally, emotionally, socially, and physically. Okay? So how weightlifting works is you push your body to its limit, and then in response, your body changes and adapts so that you can lift heavier weights, right? So now the same concept applies to other areas of human growth. So when we're forced to lift heavy loads, whether that be social, emotional, or mental, we adapt and we grow, and our ability to lift increases, okay? So also like weightlifting, attempting to lift too much or for too long of a time increases your chance of injury. So just like overtraining in weightlifting, in the physical aspect, long periods of intense stress without relief can actually decrease our lifting ability over time instead of increase it. So in other words, it makes it harder to regulate our emotions if we're under intense stress for long periods of time. So in order to explain that a little bit better, because this is also going to be key for what we're going to do in the next videos, I want to explain this using a graph. Now I know this sounds ridiculously boring, but I think it gets the point across really well and helps explain how emotional coping really works. Okay, so now take a look at this graph. All right, the horizontal side or the flat side of the graph represents kind of your typical day as time goes on, and there's ups and downs and emotions that you can see on the line here in the middle. Now, the vertical side of the graph represents your coping ability. How much of it is being used up to manage the emotions that you have. Now, just like with weightlifting, everybody's got a different amount or a different ability to cope with emotions. Now, some people have a lot of coping ability, and some people have not very much, right? Okay, but what everyone has is everybody's got a 100% line, and the 100% line is represented on this graph by that dotted line on the top there. Okay, so that line is your maximum coping load, and interesting things start to happen when you cross that 100% line. So the first thing that people notice is that when you cross the 100% line, your thinking changes. Now, why this happens is because you're pulling mental resources from other places in order to keep control of the emotion, right? In order to keep control of our behavior. Okay? So what happens is we can't focus as well. We tired much more rapidly, and we don't remember or learn as well. So as a result, life in general feels much harder because we're putting so much more energy into doing the things that we used to do every day. Okay? Now, what we generally use, the word that we generally use to describe crossing this 100% line is being overwhelmed. All right? Now, the second fact about this 100% line is that behavior suggestions, those action tendencies that were in the graph, that were in the chart that I showed you, that go along with all the core emotions. When emotion gets really strong, the urge to act on that behavior tendency gets stronger as well, okay? So the bigger the emotion, the harder it is to not act on that emotional tendency in a purely survival sort of way. So how does that play out in our lives, right? So let's say you get angry, and that anger crosses your 100% line. Well, what does anger tell you to do? Anger tells you to attack, to threaten, to break, hurt, destroy, right? So if we go over the 100% line, it's much harder not to lash out in that kind of way, and it takes more energy not to do so. So let's move on to graph number 2. In this graph, everything is exactly the same as it was on the first graph, but we've added some chronic stressors, and that's that big blue block on the bottom. So that's things like, you're not getting enough sleep, or you got a big huge project at work, you got marital problems going on, or you got some chronic pain or depression going on in the background. And every day, that chronic stressor takes up a big chunk of your emotional coping ability. And so what's left to deal with the rest of the day is much smaller. Now, what you can see is, if you take what was on graph number 1 and you put it on top of graph number 2, is that things that normally would not bother you or wouldn't push you over that 100% line, all of a sudden are pushing you over that 100% line in ways they never did before. So that snarky comment by a coworker or something your spouse says that normally you could just kind of shrug off and ignore, all of a sudden it's taken everything you got not to respond in a very hurtful or damaging way. Okay? So when this happens, we can feel like we're out of control, right? And it's important to know that sometimes those action tendencies tied to emotions make the situation better, and sometimes they don't. The goal of emotion regulation, and the key to it all, is to learn how to keep that emotion as close to or below the 100% line as humanly possible, okay? So, how do you do that? Well, that's going to be the topic of the next video. We're going to go into how do we keep those emotions regulated, or how do we tolerate distress in such a way so that we can make it through those difficult situations without doing something stupid. And what I mean by stupid is acting on those action tendencies, those behaviors that go along with the emotion that are not socially appropriate or would actually make the situation worse. Okay? And there's really only 2 ways to do that. One's called distress tolerance, and the other is called emotion regulation. And we're really going to dig into that a lot more in the next video. So I hope that was helpful for you. I hope that was educational. We're really laying the groundwork for the next videos. And just to summarize some important points here. 1, emotions are information, and they're essential to our daily lives and our survival. 2, emotions come in waves. So if you can tolerate it long enough, it'll go away while you're if you can change your situation or thoughts. And 3, weightlifting is a good example of how humans increase coping ability. And then 4, everyone has a set amount of coping. And the goal of emotional coping and stress management is to keep your emotions as much as possible below your 100% line. Okay? So again, next video we'll talk about how do you get those emotions into your optimal coping range, and we'll see you next episode. Take care.